Across time and civilizations, the word philosopher has worn many robes: teacher, rebel, sage, mystic, skeptic. In its simplest and most enduring sense, a philosopher is a lover of wisdom. Yet wisdom itself is not a static treasure, but a living pursuit. To be a philosopher, in any age or language, is not merely to possess knowledge, but to seek it relentlessly, to live with questions rather than chase certainties. From the banks of the Ganges to the academies of Athens, from Islamic courts to Confucian scroll halls, the philosopher emerges again and again, not always as a revered figure, but often as a challenger of norms, a disturber of comfort. In the West, we often begin this story with Socrates, the Athenian thinker who claimed he knew nothing and yet was sentenced to death for his words. But in truth, long before Socrates, ancient India was already debating metaphysics and the self, China was contemplating harmony and virtue, and Africa was preserving wisdom through oral tradition and proverbs as rich as any manuscript. The title philosopher is a cloak many cultures have tailored in their own way. In Sanskrit traditions, the rishi or muni, the seer, contemplated the nature of being. In China, the Shengren was not just wise, but morally cultivated. In the Islamic world, Philosopher carried forward Greek traditions while integrating revelation and reason. A philosopher, then, is not always someone who writes a treatise. They may live in a monastery, a marketplace, or a desert cave. They may speak in riddles, aphorisms, or syllogisms. What matters is their task: to question the world not just as it is, but as it could be. They are often at odds with the societies they live in, too slow for the zealots, too abstract for the rulers, too radical for the comfortable. But their ideas, once seeds, have shaped entire civilizations. Philosophy, at its best, is not a set of answers handed down in stone. It is, instead, a mirror held up to life. A good philosopher does not merely tell you what to think, but teaches you how to think. They introduce the unsettling possibility that what we take for granted, justice, truth, love, meaning, is far more complex than we imagined. In this way, philosophy is not just an academic discipline. It is a way of being, a lens through which one chooses to live more attentively, more reflectively, and more deliberately. In the chapters that follow, we will not try to cover every philosopher who ever lived. Such a task would be impossible. Instead, we will take a calm and thoughtful walk through time, pausing with some of the most influential voices that have shaped human thought. From the dialogues of Plato to the meditations of Confucius, from the soaring visions of Avicenna to the fierce clarity of Mary Wollstonecraft, from the existential questions of Camus to the political ethics of Arendt, each chapter is a window into a different world. And yet, they speak across time to one another. This journey will be more than just a chronological list. While we'll move roughly through time, from ancient Greece to the modern world, we will also cross continents. Europe, yes, but also Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and beyond. Philosophy is a global heritage. It has spoken in Arabic and Mandarin, in Sanskrit and Greek, in Latin and French, in Yoruba and German. It has taken root in palaces, in classrooms, in prisons, and on protest signs. What unites these thinkers, separated by centuries, cultures, and concerns, is not a single doctrine or ideology. It is the courage to think deeply, to ask, with sincerity and humility, the questions that lie at the root of human life. What is the good? What is truth? What does it mean to be free? What is the self? What can we know? What should we do? And perhaps, above all, how should we live? As we move gently through these stories, let this not be a lecture, but a reflection. These thinkers did not live perfect lives, nor did they always agree with each other. But in their diverse voices, we find a mosaic of insight, fragments of wisdom for a world still searching for meaning. So now, let us begin our journey with the figure who never wrote a word, yet taught the world to ask. Let us walk with Socrates. In the streets of ancient Athens, in the open air of the agora, there once walked a man who claimed to know nothing, and yet changed the course of Western philosophy forever. Socrates, born in 470 BCE, left behind no scrolls, no written teachings, no formal treatises, and yet his presence still ripples through every corner of philosophy. We know him only through the voices of others, most notably his student Plato and the historian Xenophon, who sought to preserve the conversations and methods of their teacher long after his death. Socrates himself was an unusual figure by the standards of his time. Unlike the traveling sophists who charged for their instruction, Socrates refused to take money. He dressed plainly, lived modestly, and spent his days wandering the city, engaging anyone, from slaves to senators, in conversation. But these weren't idle chats. Socrates asked questions, and then he asked more. His purpose was not to lecture or debate, but to dig, carefully, methodically, relentlessly, into the assumptions people held about justice, virtue, courage, and knowledge. His method, later called the Socratic method, was simple in form, yet revolutionary in effect. Rather than claim to know the truth, Socrates positioned himself as a kind of intellectual midwife, helping others give birth to their own understanding. He would begin with a question, often quite ordinary. What is courage? What is justice? What is the good life? The person he questioned would give an answer, usually something conventional or accepted by society. Socrates would then gently, or sometimes stubbornly, show the contradictions, gaps, or vagueness in their reply. This was not meant to humiliate, though it often unsettled. It was meant to awaken. In uncovering their ignorance, Socrates believed he was doing a service, inviting people to examine their lives more deeply, to replace inherited opinions with genuine understanding. As he famously stated in Plato's Apology, the unexamined life is not worth living. In a world where authority often depended on perceived wisdom, the confidence of the politician, the piety of the priest, the certainty of the teacher, Socrates' constant questioning struck many as disruptive. He was, in a sense, too democratic in his thinking. He believed that anyone could engage in philosophy, that wisdom was not the sole property of the elite, and that truth could be discovered not through dogma, but through dialogue. Yet for all his humility, Socrates was not without sharp edges. He could be pointed in his questioning, even sarcastic. He was seen by many of Athens' powerful citizens as dangerous, not because he wielded weapons, but because he wielded ideas. He questioned traditional gods, exposed the pretensions of leaders, and encouraged the youth to think for themselves. In time, that proved too much. In 399 BCE, Socrates was brought to trial, accused of corrupting the youth and impiety, not believing in the gods of the city. In court, he refused to back down or plead for mercy. His defense, recorded in Plato's Apology, remains one of the most powerful declarations of intellectual integrity ever written. he told the court that he would rather die than cease to question. And so he was sentenced to death. Given the opportunity to escape or beg for exile, Socrates refused. To him, to flee would be to betray the very principles he lived for. Instead, surrounded by friends, he drank a cup of hemlock and passed into history. What remains remarkable is that Socrates, who wrote nothing and sought no fame, became the cornerstone of Western philosophy. His commitment to dialogue, to critical self-examination, and to the pursuit of virtue over popularity has inspired generations. Through Plato's dialogues, especially works like the Apology, Euthyphro, and Crito, we hear his voice, calm yet piercing, always returning us to the core of human life. What does it mean to live well? In a world overwhelmed with information, Socrates reminds us of the power of a simple question. In an age that often values quick answers, he invites us to slow down, to reflect, and to embrace the discomfort of not knowing. His life and death suggest that philosophy is not just a set of ideas, but a way of being in the world, a way of living with greater honesty, humility, and depth. Socrates' final days unfolded not in obscurity, but in the charged atmosphere of an Athenian courtroom, a setting that would become as symbolic as any battlefield or Senate chamber in the shaping of intellectual history. At 70 years old, after a lifetime of roaming Athens and challenging its citizens to question the very foundations of their beliefs, Socrates was brought to trial in 399 BCE. The charges against him were weighty: impiety and the corruption of the youth of Athens. But as with much of Socrates' life, the real reasons were more layered, more political, more psychological. Athens had recently suffered the trauma of defeat in the Peloponnesian War, followed by the harsh rule of the 30 tyrants, and was in a fragile process of restoration. In this context, Socrates, who was known for criticizing democratic processes and who had associations with individuals like Critias, one of the tyrants, became an easy scapegoat for the tensions of the time. His relentless questioning of authority figures, his challenges to traditional piety, and his influence on young Athenians made many uncomfortable. Where others flattered and obeyed, Socrates interrogated and prodded. At his trial, recorded vividly in Plato's Apology, Socrates made no effort to charm the jury. He did not plead for his life. Instead, he maintained the same stance he had throughout his years of philosophical inquiry, a commitment to the examined life. He declared boldly that he would rather die than give up philosophy. He compared himself to a gadfly, stinging the slow-moving horse of Athens to keep it awake and alert. If executed, he warned, the city would lose a voice that helped preserve its moral vitality. Rather than express remorse or fear, Socrates remained steady, even ironic. When asked what punishment he thought he deserved, he suggested he be rewarded, perhaps with free meals for life, the traditional honor given to Olympic champions. This defiance did not amuse the jury. They sentenced him to death. Yet even then, Socrates did not flee from his fate. Though his friends, including Crito, arranged a plan for escape, he refused. To escape, he argued, would be to betray the principles of justice and law that he had lived by. Laws, he said, were like the city's parents. Disobeying them would harm not just the city, but one's own soul. He had lived as a citizen of Athens. Now he would die as one. And so, in a quiet prison cell, surrounded by his closest companions, Socrates drank the cup of hemlock. Plato describes the scene with calm reverence. Socrates speaking to his friends until his voice faltered, until the numbness crept up his limbs, and finally, until he lay still. No drama, no spectacle, just the quiet passing of a man who had lived and now died by the courage of his convictions. What makes Socrates' death so enduring is not only the injustice of the verdict, but the moral clarity with which he met it. His death was not a failure of philosophy, but its affirmation. In choosing death over silence, he demonstrated that philosophy is not simply a tool for clever argument or theoretical speculation. It is a way of life, a commitment to honesty, virtue, and the disciplined care of the soul. Socrates left behind no writings, no formal school, and yet his legacy is immeasurable. He transformed philosophy from an exploration of the natural world, as pursued by the pre-Socratic thinkers, into an intimate dialogue with the self and society. He moved the gaze inward, asking not, "What is the cosmos made of?" but "How should we live?" His influence echoes most famously through his student Plato, who used Socratic dialogues not only to honor his teacher, but to explore the very structure of reality, ethics, and politics. These dialogues shaped Western philosophy for over 2 millennia. But beyond Plato, the Socratic legacy inspired the Stoics, early Christians, Enlightenment thinkers, and even modern existentialists. Central to that legacy is the idea that philosophy begins with recognizing one's ignorance. For Socrates, wisdom was not possessing answers, but understanding the limits of one's knowledge. This humility forms the bedrock of philosophical inquiry. It invites us to question inherited beliefs, to seek coherence between our actions and our values, and to cultivate a life of thoughtfulness rather than reaction. Moreover, Socrates taught that virtue is not something bestowed by birth or status. It is something practiced, something forged in the crucible of daily choices. Philosophy, then, is not an academic pursuit, but a moral endeavor. It is about examining the self, refining one's character, and aspiring toward the good, not in abstract terms, but in the way we live with others, with our communities, and with ourselves. In the quiet of night, when the distractions of the world fade, the Socratic voice still whispers, not with answers, but with questions. What do you believe? Why do you live as you do? Socrates reminds us that the examined life may not be easy. It may lead us to discomfort, to solitude, or even, as in his case, to punishment. But it is, above all, a life of integrity. As we leave the cobbled streets of Athens behind, we turn our gaze eastward toward the ancient courts of China. There, another great mind, Confucius, walked a different path. While Socrates probed and provoked, Confucius sought harmony, ritual, and the ethics of human relation. Let us now journey there. As we move from the stone paths of Athens to the storied villages of ancient China, we step into a world shaped not by dialectical questioning, but by the quiet rhythm of ritual, tradition, and harmony. Here, amid the backdrop of political disunity and social chaos, emerged one of the most influential thinkers in human history, Confucius, known in Chinese as Confuzi or Master Kong. Confucius was born in 551 BCE in the small state of Lu, during a time of great upheaval known as the Spring and Autumn period, which soon gave way to the even more turbulent Warring States era. While Greece was fostering democracy and philosophical debate, China was fragmented into dozens of states, constantly at war for power, territory, and survival. This disunity brought widespread suffering, loss of moral direction, and a crisis of social order. In response to this chaos, Confucius did not seek revolution or conquest. Instead, he looked backward to the moral clarity and harmony of a supposedly golden past. His teachings were not about abstract metaphysics or speculative cosmology. They were about how human beings ought to live with one another, in family, in community, and in the state. At the heart of Confucius' philosophy is the concept of Ren, often translated as benevolence, humaneness, or goodness. Yet no single English word captures its depth. Ren is a quality of the heart, an inner moral disposition to care for others, to act compassionately, and to embody virtue in every relationship. A person who possesses Ren is not merely kind, they are profoundly attuned to the needs and dignity of others. They cultivate empathy not just in moments of crisis, but as a daily practice, a way of being in the world. But Ren, Confucius taught, must be expressed through li, which refers to ritual, propriety, and the proper way of doing things. Li is not limited to religious ceremonies or formal events. It governs all aspects of life: how one bows to a parent, how one addresses a superior, how one conducts a meal or a funeral. In the Confucian vision, Li is the structure through which Ren flows. It brings order to emotion, channeling love, respect, and duty into actions that sustain the fabric of society. Where Western traditions often prize spontaneity or authenticity, Confucius elevated the power of repetition and reverence. To perform rituals correctly was not to be robotic, but to align oneself with the wisdom of generations. In doing so, one becomes a better person, not through personal expression, but through disciplined, graceful participation in the social world. Another essential pillar of Confucian thought is filial piety, xiao, the deep respect and devotion one owes to parents and ancestors. Filial piety is not simply obedience. It is a form of love that honors the debt we owe to those who raised us. It acknowledges that we are not self-made, but shaped by the care, guidance, and sacrifices of others. This attitude extends upward, from children to parents and ultimately to rulers, but also downward, as leaders must govern with benevolence and justice. In this sense, the family becomes a miniature model of the ideal state. A child who learns to treat their parents with respect will carry that ethic into wider society. A ruler who governs as a father, cares for a child, will win the loyalty and harmony of the people. Confucius believed that if individuals cultivated virtue in their private lives, it would radiate outward, healing the chaos of the broader world. While many today think of Confucianism as conservative or hierarchical, it was in its time a radical call to moral renewal. Confucius did not advocate blind loyalty. He believed in remonstration, that a son should respectfully challenge a father if the father was wrong, just as a minister should advise a misguided ruler. His teachings were not about submission, but about cultivating virtue in both followers and leaders. Confucius's influence was not immediate. He held several minor government posts, but never achieved high office. His political ambitions were largely unfulfilled during his lifetime. Yet he remained dedicated to teaching, gathering a circle of devoted disciples who recorded his sayings and stories in what became known as the Analects. It was only after his death that Confucius's thought blossomed into a central pillar of Chinese civilization. During the Han Dynasty, centuries later, Confucianism was adopted as the official ideology of the state. His emphasis on education, virtue, and social harmony became embedded in China's civil service exams, moral instruction, and political theory for over 2,000 years. Beyond China, Confucian ideals spread to Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and other parts of East Asia. His teachings shaped how people thought about family, governance, gender roles, and education, weaving into the daily habits of millions of lives. And today, even as modernity has challenged many traditional forms, Confucius's voice remains present, not as a strict lawgiver, but as a quiet guide. In an age often marked by noise, speed, and fragmentation, his call to harmonize the inner self with the outer world still resonates. His vision offers a counterbalance, one where virtue is not shouted but lived, where strength lies not in domination but in self-discipline and care. The moral universe of Confucius is one rooted not in abstraction but in everyday conduct. His deep emphasis on virtue, lay at the heart of his teachings. For Confucius, a good society is not built on laws alone, but on the character of its people. In this vision, virtue is cultivated patiently, in small gestures and habitual kindness, through a lifelong commitment to ethical living. Rather than declaring fixed doctrines, Confucius encouraged reflection on one's role and responsibilities, always with the goal of becoming a junzi, the noble or exemplary person. The junzi is not noble by birth, but by conduct. Such a person embodies humility, integrity, and restraint, modeling these qualities not to command others, but to uplift them. Confucius believed that leadership by example was more powerful than any punishment or decree. In fact, he stated that if rulers were virtuous, their people would follow out of reverence, not fear. If the people are led by laws, and uniformity is sought to be given them by punishments, he warned, they will try to avoid the punishment, but have no sense of shame. If they are led by virtue, and uniformity is sought to be given them by the rules of propriety, they will have the sense of shame and, moreover, will become good. This vision of moral guidance over coercion underscores his broader emphasis on order. For Confucius, social harmony was not stifling, it was liberating. Within a well-ordered society, each person knows their role and fulfills it with devotion and grace. This is not to say roles are unchangeable or unjust. Rather, Confucian order is aspirational. It begins with self-discipline, flows outward into the family, extends to the community, and ultimately shapes the state. His social ethics placed profound importance on human relationships. The 5 key relationships, ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, elder brother and younger brother, friend and friend, form the scaffolding of society. Each came with reciprocal duties. The father must guide, but also care. The ruler must govern, but also listen. Even the seemingly unequal relationships contained seeds of mutual responsibility. This orientation toward ethical reciprocity produced a society where obligations were not seen as burdens, but as expressions of respect. Every role, no matter how modest, carried dignity when performed with care. In a time of warlords and shifting alliances, this call to moral constancy was both stabilizing and radical. The reach of Confucius's ideas extended far beyond his own lifetime. Over centuries, and especially during the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, Confucianism was not only revived, but canonized. The state adopted it as the foundation of governance, embedding its principles into the civil service examination system, a model that would influence China for nearly 2 millennia. Aspiring bureaucrats were required to study Confucian classics, the Analects, Book of Rites, Mencius, and others, and to write essays demonstrating their moral understanding and capacity for judgment. Governance thus became intertwined with scholarship, and learning was elevated to a sacred public duty. In contrast to many societies where power was inherited or seized, Confucian influence encouraged a system where intellectual and ethical training, at least in theory, could earn one a place in the ruling class. Beyond government, education itself took on a Confucian character. Learning was not simply the acquisition of information, but the refinement of the self. Schools focused on rote memorization, respectful inquiry, and the cultivation of discipline. Even calligraphy, poetry, and music were understood as ways of shaping one's character and harmonizing with the rhythms of life. A well-educated person was expected not only to be literate, but to embody harmony in word and deed. In the home, Confucian influence was equally profound. Filial piety became the cornerstone of family life. Children were taught to honor parents and ancestors, not only in ritual, but in everyday obedience and gratitude. The family was seen as a microcosm of the state, a training ground for civic virtue. Hierarchies existed, but they were softened by the expectation of care and mutual respect. Parents, too, had duties to educate, protect, and serve as moral examples. This emphasis on duty and harmony has had enduring consequences in East Asia. In Korea, Confucianism was adopted as the state ideology during the Joseon dynasty, shaping legal codes, gender norms, and administrative structures. In Japan, it informed Tokugawa policies and education systems. In Vietnam, Confucian thought blended with local traditions, influencing dynastic governance and social behavior. Critically, Confucianism was never a monolith. It evolved and adapted to regional cultures and historical moments. Neo-Confucian thinkers in the Song and Ming dynasties introduced metaphysical interpretations that engaged with Taoist and Buddhist ideas. Modern reformers have revisited Confucian ethics to address contemporary issues such as democracy, gender equality, and human rights. But at its core, the Confucian legacy continues to offer a framework for ethical reflection, communal responsibility, and the cultivation of peace in a fractured world. Even today, as East Asia balances modernization with tradition, Confucian ideals remain embedded in cultural rhythms, in reverence for elders, emphasis on education, and the pursuit of social cohesion. While critics point to the ways Confucianism has sometimes reinforced patriarchy or conformity, others see in it a valuable counterweight to individualism, materialism, and social alienation. In a time when global societies grapple with questions of trust, leadership, and moral responsibility, the gentle wisdom of Confucius still echoes. His belief in leading by example, in building society not through force but through virtue, offers not a utopia but a vision, steady, modest, and enduring. As we leave the structured order as Confucian harmony, we turn now to a philosopher who imagined reality itself as an illusion, and truth as something eternal, hidden behind shadows. We now journey to Athens once more to meet the thinker who shaped much of Western thought, Plato. In the cool courtyards of ancient Athens, under the shadowed colonnades of the Academy, a man named Plato quietly changed how we think about the world. He was born into an aristocratic family during a time of political upheaval, but his ambitions reached far beyond the narrow struggles of the city-state. To Plato, the soul's truest calling was not to rule or conquer, but to understand. And in his lifelong quest for understanding, he left us with some of the most enduring philosophical ideas in human history. Plato was more than just a thinker. He was the careful bridge between two giants. On one side stood Socrates, his mentor, whose relentless questioning had shaken the moral foundations of Athens. Socrates wrote nothing down, but his voice echoes through Plato's dialogues, preserved like a candle flame held aloft. On the other side was Aristotle, his student, who would later chart a more empirical path through logic and biology. Plato stood in between, gazing upwards, asking not what is, but what ought to be. In the Apology, Phaedo, Meno, and especially the Republic, Plato brought philosophy to life through dialogue. He didn't lecture. Instead, he staged conversations, often featuring Socrates as a way to draw the reader into reflection. He saw philosophy not as dogma, but as dialectic, a process of shared inquiry, of peeling back the layers of belief to reach something more eternal. Nowhere is this more evident than in his theory of forms. To Plato, the physical world around us, the things we see, touch, and experience, is not the ultimate reality. It is merely a shadow of a deeper, unchanging truth. Just as a reflection in a pool is not the object itself, our sensory world only gestures toward the eternal forms that lie beyond. These forms are perfect and immutable. The form of beauty is not any one beautiful thing, but the essence of beauty itself. The form of justice is not a law or verdict, but the pure idea of justice, eternal, absolute, and unaffected by human error. Likewise, the form of the good is the ultimate source of all that is meaningful and knowable. Plato described the good as the sun of the intellectual world, illuminating all other truths and giving them life. To grasp these forms, one must rise above opinion and perception. In the famous Allegory of the Cave, Plato describes prisoners chained in a cave, seeing only shadows cast on the wall. These shadows, like the world we perceive, are not reality. They are illusions. One prisoner escapes and ascends to the world above, where he sees the true forms in the light of the sun. When he returns to tell the others, they reject his vision. This allegory, haunting and poetic, reflects Plato's belief that philosophy is not only difficult, it is dangerous. The path to truth is steep and lonely. This is why education, for Plato, was not about filling minds with facts, but guiding the soul out of ignorance and into the light of understanding. In the Republic, he proposed a radical vision, a society ruled by philosopher kings, those rare individuals who had climbed out of the cave and returned with wisdom. They would rule not for wealth or power, but because they had seen the good and could shape a just society. But Plato was no naive utopian. He knew that politics is messy and that the soul must struggle to overcome the temptations of desire, pride, and illusion. The tripartite soul he described, reason, spirit, and appetite, mirrors the city itself. Just as a balanced city requires wise rulers, courageous defenders, and disciplined workers, so too does a well-lived life require harmony between our higher reasoning, our passions, and our needs. The world of forms is not distant fantasy for Plato. It is the realest thing there is, more real than tables and trees, more lasting than empires or laws. and while we cannot see the forms with our eyes, we can sense them in moments of clarity, justice, and beauty. They are the standard by which we measure all things, and the goal toward which the soul ascends through philosophy. As Plato aged, he founded the Academy, the first great university of the Western world. There, generations of thinkers would study his dialogues and continue the search for the good. His student Aristotle would take a different path, more grounded, more scientific, but even he could not escape the shadow of Plato's forms. Today, whether we ponder the nature of justice, debate the meaning of love, or wonder what lies beyond the veil of appearances, we walk in Plato's footsteps. He reminds us that wisdom is not the possession of answers, but the courage to ask the right questions, again and again, even when the world turns away. Among Plato's many works, none stands as grand and enduring as the Republic. Written as a series of dialogues led by Socrates, it is not merely a political treatise, but a vast philosophical exploration of justice, the soul, truth, and the ideal society. For Plato, politics could not be separated from ethics, nor the soul from the city. To ask what a just society looks like was, in the end, to ask what a just person is. The Republic begins with a deceptively simple question: what is justice? In the hands of lesser thinkers, the discussion might have stopped at rules or laws, but Plato takes the reader on a journey far beyond, into the nature of power, the education of rulers, the purpose of art, the shape of the human soul, and the architecture of an ideal city. At the heart of this vision stands the concept of the philosopher king. For Plato, the best rulers are not warriors, merchants, or politicians, but philosophers, those rare individuals who love wisdom, seek the truth beyond appearances, and care not for wealth or personal power. They are the ones who, through rigorous training and self-discipline, ascend to knowledge of the good. Only they, he argues, can govern justly. This was a radical idea, and it remains so. The idea that rule should be entrusted to those most capable of moral insight and intellectual clarity continues to challenge democratic and autocratic models alike. Plato didn't idealize these philosopher kings as aloof dreamers. They would be trained in mathematics, dialectic, and physical fitness. They would be tested in hardship and rewarded not with gold, but with responsibility. They would live communally, without private property or families, to avoid personal corruption. It was a vision both idealistic and austere, a society designed not to serve the desires of the many, but to cultivate the virtues of the few. To support this framework, Plato presents one of his most powerful images, the allegory of the cave. It is more than a metaphor, it is a deep reflection on human ignorance and awakening. Imagine, he says, prisoners chained in a cave since birth. All they can see are shadows cast on a wall by objects behind them, manipulated by unseen puppeteers. These shadows are their reality. If one prisoner escapes and sees the outside world, he is blinded at first, but slowly comes to see real objects, the sun and the truth. If he returns to the cave to free the others, they will mock him, even kill him. The allegory speaks not only to the philosopher's journey toward truth, but also to society's resistance to change and enlightenment. The cave is not merely ancient Athens. It is every society that confuses appearance for truth, opinion for knowledge. It is each of us when we settle for comfort over clarity. Plato's challenge still echoes, to turn toward the light, even when it burns. Beyond political theory and metaphysics, the Republic dives into aesthetics, education, psychology, and mythology. Plato discusses the role of poetry and art, famously suggesting that artists might be banished from the ideal city because they imitate appearances rather than convey truths. He offers a vision of education as the gentle turning of the soul toward truth, not the stuffing of minds with data, but the cultivation of reason and harmony. To bring such a vision into reality, Plato founded the Academy around 387 BCE, considered the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. Located in a grove near Athens, the Academy was not a school in the modern sense, but a community of learners. There were no formal curricula or degrees. Instead, students gathered around Plato, discussed mathematics, ethics, astronomy, and metaphysics. They questioned, debated, and searched for the good. Among the Academy's most famous students was Aristotle, whose own philosophical system would eventually diverge from his teachers. But the tradition Plato began of organized philosophical inquiry, of asking questions in a disciplined environment, would spread across the centuries, shaping medieval scholasticism, the Renaissance, and the rise of modern universities. The Academy would endure, in various forms, for nearly 1,000 years. Its spiritual legacy, the belief that education can refine the soul, that knowledge is a path to justice, continues in classrooms and lecture halls around the world. In the Republic, Plato gave the world not a blueprint to be followed blindly, but a mirror in which to examine our own societies and selves. He dared to ask what justice truly is, not just in laws or institutions, but in the order of our hearts. He imagined a world where rulers rule because they know what is good, and citizens thrive because they are educated to seek truth. And so, as we leave the grand halls of Plato's thought and step into the more empirical, earth-bound investigations of his most famous student, we carry with us the light of the cave's exit, the belief that behind every shadow lies a deeper form, and behind every question, a truer answer waits. Now we turn to Aristotle, who sought to classify and understand the world as it is, even as he built upon the idealism of his master. Where Plato soared into the world of ideal forms, Aristotle brought philosophy down to earth. If Plato was the dreamer of perfect realms, Aristotle was the patient observer of nature's details. His mind was not content with just asking what is good or true. He wanted to categorize, to test, to organize the entire structure of knowledge. It is no exaggeration to say that Aristotle laid the foundation for much of Western science and philosophy, and his legacy reaches into nearly every discipline of human inquiry. Born in 384 BCE in Stagira, a town in northern Greece, Aristotle was sent to Athens at the age of 17 to study at Plato's Academy. He remained there for 2 decades. Though deeply influenced by Plato, Aristotle was not a passive disciple. He questioned his teacher's reliance on transcendental forms and argued that knowledge comes not from innate ideas, but from experience and observation. This difference would later create a sharp philosophical contrast: idealism versus empiricism, a tension that continues to echo through intellectual history. After Plato's death, Aristotle traveled widely. He eventually settled in the Macedonian court, where he was appointed as tutor to a young prince named Alexander, later known as Alexander the Great. Though we don't have detailed records of their lessons, Aristotle's influence on Alexander's appreciation for Greek culture and science was significant. Here we glimpse the philosopher not only as a thinker, but as a mentor to one of history's most consequential rulers. Yet Aristotle's true calling was not court life, but study. He returned to Athens and founded his own school, the Lyceum. Unlike the Academy, which leaned toward abstract speculation, the Lyceum emphasized empirical observation, categorization, and logical reasoning. It was a bustling center of research where students would walk and talk. The reason Aristotle's followers came to be known as the Peripatetics, from the Greek peripatein, meaning to walk about. Aristotle's intellectual range is staggering. In logic, he developed the syllogism, a method of reasoning where conclusions are drawn from two premises. For example, all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This form of deductive reasoning became the standard framework for logical thought for nearly 2,000 years. His work, Organon, became the cornerstone of logic in both the Islamic and Christian worlds during the Middle Ages. In ethics, Aristotle's approach was markedly practical. Rather than prescribe universal rules, he focused on human character and the pursuit of eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or the good life. His famous concept of the golden mean held that virtue lies between extremes. Courage is a balance between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity lies between stinginess and extravagance. Ethics, for Aristotle, was not about abstract ideals, but about cultivating habits that lead to a balanced, meaningful life. His treatise, Nicomachean Ethics, named after his son, remains a touchstone in moral philosophy to this day. Aristotle's metaphysics, literally beyond the physical, explored the nature of reality itself. He sought to understand being as being, asking what it means for something to exist. He proposed that everything in the universe is a combination of form and matter, potential and actuality. A seed, for example, contains the potential to become a tree. Its purpose, or telos, is embedded within it. This teleological view, that everything has a purpose or end, shaped centuries of philosophical and theological thinking. In biology, Aristotle was a pioneer. He studied over 500 species of animals, dissected marine life, and classified organisms based on their observable traits. Though many of his conclusions were later corrected, his method, careful observation and comparative analysis, laid the groundwork for the scientific method. In fact, Charles Darwin once called Aristotle the greatest biological thinker of all time. His contributions to politics were equally profound. In his work, Politics, Aristotle analyzed various forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, oligarchy, and advocated for a mixed constitution that balanced different elements. Unlike Plato, who envisioned an ideal city ruled by philosophers, Aristotle studied existing city-states and asked what made them succeed or fail. He believed that a good government was one that promoted the common good and allowed citizens to live virtuous lives. His idea of the human being as a political animal, naturally inclined toward community and governance, remains one of the most quoted concepts in political theory. And yet, Aristotle was not merely a philosopher for specialists. He was a builder of systems, uniting ethics with politics, biology with metaphysics, and logic with rhetoric. He believed that knowledge was not the possession of isolated disciplines, but an integrated whole. His goal was to understand the cosmos and our place in it, not as detached observers, but as engaged participants in a living, ordered universe. In the landscape of ancient philosophy, few works have endured as resiliently and gracefully as Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, named after either his father or his son, both of whom were called Nicomachus. This text stands as one of the earliest comprehensive explorations of human virtue, character, and the ultimate goal of life. But unlike lofty metaphysical treatises or rigid moral codes, Nicomachean Ethics is quietly practical, a calm reflection on how human beings, in their ordinary daily actions, might live good, meaningful, and balanced lives. At the heart of Aristotle's ethical thought lies a deceptively simple yet profound idea, the golden mean. For Aristotle, virtue is not an extreme, it is a deliberate balance between deficiency and excess. Take courage, for example. Too little of it, and one is a coward. Too much, and one becomes reckless. Courage, as a virtue, lies in the measured middle, the golden mean. This idea applies not only to bravery, but to generosity, honesty, temperance, pride, ambition, and nearly every other moral trait. Aristotle thus positions virtue not as a rigid rule to follow, but as a flexible habit of moderation, cultivated through reason and guided by practical wisdom, phronesis. What sets Aristotle's ethics apart is that it is not rooted in divine command or rigid universal law, but in human nature and experience. He begins not with commandments, but with a simple question: what is the purpose of human life? His answer is eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but better understood as flourishing or living well. Eudaimonia is not a momentary pleasure or fleeting joy, but the enduring state of living in accordance with virtue. To be a good human is not to obey blindly, but to develop one's character, reason well, and live in harmony with others. Ethics, for Aristotle, is a lifelong project of self-formation. This emphasis on the practical nature of virtue, that it arises from habit, community, and reasoned action, made Aristotle's ethical system highly adaptable across cultures and eras. As his works traveled beyond the Greek world, they found fertile ground in the great religious and intellectual traditions of the medieval period. In fact, it was during the so-called Dark Ages in Europe that Aristotle's ideas would be preserved and reborn, not in Athens, but in the intellectual hubs of the Islamic world. During the Islamic Golden Age, roughly the 9th to 12th centuries, philosophers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Averroes, Ibn Rushd, saw in Aristotle a powerful framework for integrating faith and reason. Al-Farabi, often called the second teacher after Aristotle, built political theories grounded in Aristotelian ethics and metaphysics. Avicenna's Book of Healing incorporated Aristotelian logic and ethics into Islamic theology, laying the groundwork for centuries of philosophical theology in the Muslim world. Averroes went further, writing extensive commentaries on nearly all of Aristotle's works, arguing passionately that faith and philosophy need not conflict, that revelation and reason could harmonize. Aristotle's influence also crossed into Jewish thought, especially through figures like Maimonides, 1138 to 1204. In his magnum opus Guide for the Perplexed, Maimonides drew heavily on Aristotle's ethical and metaphysical principles, adapting them to fit within a monotheistic framework. For Maimonides, the pursuit of intellectual and moral perfection, echoing Aristotle's eudaimonia, was not merely a philosophical quest, but a spiritual one. The golden mean, too, appears prominently in Maimonides' writings, as he urges a balance of character and avoidance of extremes in all things. Meanwhile, in Christian Europe, Aristotle's works re-entered the West primarily through Arabic translations, later retranslated into Latin. This revival set the stage for Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274, the towering medieval theologian whose Summa Theologica sought to reconcile Christian doctrine with Aristotelian philosophy. Aquinas adopted Aristotle's concept of natural law, the idea that moral order can be discerned through reason and is embedded in the fabric of the universe. Aquinas also emphasized the golden mean and saw eudaimonia not as mere earthly happiness, but as a signpost pointing toward eternal union with God. In Aquinas' synthesis, Aristotle became not a pagan outsider, but a respected ally in the Christian intellectual tradition. By the 13th century, Aristotle's authority was so profound that he was referred to simply as the philosopher. In cathedral schools, monasteries, and universities, his logic, ethics, and physics were not just subjects of study. They were the foundation of all learning. His influence shaped scholastic thought, scientific method, and even church doctrine. Yet, despite this reverence, Aristotle's ethics retained their humble practicality. They continued to speak not only to theologians and kings, but to anyone wondering how to live with wisdom, humility, and balance. Even today, Aristotle's golden mean remains a guiding light for those navigating the pressures of modern life. In a world of extremes, political, emotional, digital, the idea that virtue lies in moderation feels quietly radical. And in an era of quick answers and loud voices, Aristotle's ethics invite us to slow down, to reflect, and to cultivate a life not just of pleasure or success, but of depth and integrity. As the lantern of classical wisdom passed through centuries and civilizations, it lit the path not just for kings and clerics, but for anyone willing to ask, "What kind of person should I become?" Aristotle's answer, methodical, hopeful, human, continues to echo wherever thoughtful lives are being lived. And now, as we turn the page from ancient Greece to the dazzling intellectual ferment of the Islamic world, we find that the legacy of Aristotle did not end. It blossomed. As the classical world faded into the shadows of post-Roman Europe, a new light arose in the East, a golden age of thought and inquiry that would preserve, reinterpret, and transform the legacies of Greece and Persia. The Islamic Golden Age, stretching from the 8th to the 13th century, was a time of profound intellectual ferment across cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo, and Samarkand. In its heart lay a tradition that did not merely copy Aristotle and Plato, but challenged, extended, and wove their insights into an intricate tapestry of faith, reason, and scientific pursuit. Among the towering figures of this era stood Al-Farabi, known in the Latin West as Al-Farabius. Often called the second teacher, second only to Aristotle, Al-Farabi, circa 872 to 950 CE, was born in Farab, in what is today Kazakhstan. A polymath fluent in logic, music, metaphysics, and political theory, he played a crucial role in introducing Greek philosophy to the Arabic-speaking world. But his work was not that of a translator alone. He was an original thinker in his own right. Al-Farabi sought to reconcile philosophy with Islamic theology and to build a coherent system of knowledge that could unify the world's truths. In his political philosophy, he envisioned an ideal society ruled by a virtuous philosopher king, echoing Plato's Republic, but framed within a monotheistic worldview. The ruler, for Al-Farabi, was not just a guardian of laws, but a conduit of divine knowledge, embodying wisdom, justice, and truth. His famous work, The Virtuous City, described a society where reason, revelation, and virtue coexisted in harmony, and where the aim of politics was not power, but the perfection of the human soul. Al-Farabi also made groundbreaking contributions to logic, extending Aristotle's system while adapting it to Arabic grammar and thought. He helped distinguish between different types of knowledge: empirical, demonstrative, philosophical, and theological, setting the stage for later thinkers to explore their boundaries and interconnections. For him, logic was not merely a tool for argument, but the foundation of clear and disciplined thought. If Al-Farabi served as a philosophical architect, then Avicenna or Ibn Sina, 980 to 1037 CE, was its master builder. Born in the village of Afshana near Bukhara in present-day Uzbekistan, Avicenna was a child prodigy who had memorized the Quran by age 10 and mastered medicine before he turned 16. By his early 20s, he had already written several medical treatises and begun composing what would become two of the most influential works of the medieval world: the Book of Healing and the Canon of Medicine. In the Book of Healing, Kitab al-Shifa, Avicenna set out not to cure bodies, but to heal the human mind through philosophy. This vast encyclopedia covered logic, natural sciences, metaphysics, and psychology, presenting a unified vision of reality built on reason and observation. He accepted much of Aristotle's metaphysics, but introduced refinements of his own, notably his distinction between essence and existence, which would later influence both Islamic theologians and Christian scholastics like Thomas Aquinas. Avicenna's metaphysical system was elegant and bold. At its core was the concept of the necessary existent, a being whose essence and existence are one and the same, and from whom all contingent beings derive. This necessary existent for Avicenna was God, not a deity bound by anthropomorphic attributes, but a timeless, self-sufficient source of all being. His view of the soul was equally subtle. He argued for the soul's independence from the body and proposed thought experiments, such as the famous flying man, to demonstrate that self-awareness is independent of sensory experience. Beyond philosophy, Avicenna's medical writings became standard references in both the Islamic world and Europe for centuries. His Canon of Medicine was taught at European universities as late as the 17th century. Yet despite his scientific achievements, Avicenna remained a philosopher at heart, someone who saw the unity of truth in all disciplines, whether one studied the stars, the soul, or the structure of the state. Together, Al-Farabi and Avicenna helped shape a vision of the human being not as a passive recipient of divine truths, but as an active seeker, a rational, ethical, and spiritual creature capable of contemplating both the cosmos and the self. They lived in a time when philosophy was not confined to ivory towers, but found in the bustling streets of Baghdad, in hospitals, libraries, and courts of kings, where ideas moved freely across languages, religions, and borders. As the golden light of Islamic philosophy reached its zenith, it cast long shadows across the Mediterranean, shadows that would stretch into medieval Europe and illuminate the minds of Christian thinkers for centuries. At the center of this intellectual bridge stood Averroes, known in the Islamic world as Ibn Rushd, 1126 to 1198 CE. A figure both deeply faithful to tradition and radically committed to the sovereignty of reason. He was not a revolutionary in the loud iconoclastic sense, but in the quiet, meticulous way of those who believe that truth must be uncovered line by line through debate, logic, and clarity. Born in Córdoba, in Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus, Ibn Rushd lived in a world where philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and theology coexisted in vibrant exchange. He studied law and Islamic jurisprudence, rising to prominence as a qadi, judge, but his true calling was philosophical commentary. His most enduring legacy was his rigorous engagement with Aristotle, whose works he read not merely as a scholar, but as a devoted interlocutor. Averroes produced extensive commentaries, long, middle, and short versions, on nearly all of Aristotle's major texts, including the Metaphysics, the Nicomachean Ethics, and De Anima, on the Soul. These were not mere summaries, they were deep meditations, explanatory expansions, and sometimes corrections aimed at clarifying Aristotle's often difficult texts. Averroes believed that Aristotle represented the highest pinnacle of human reason. Where others might shy away from the philosopher's challenges to religious orthodoxy, Averroes leaned in. In his view, reason and faith were not enemies but companions, each with its own domain, and both ultimately leading to the truth. His famous treatise, The Incoherence of the Incoherence, Tahafut al-Tahafut, was a direct response to the theologian Al-Ghazali, who had criticized philosophy as dangerous to faith. Averroes, without sarcasm or hostility, defended the autonomy of philosophical inquiry, arguing that truth cannot contradict truth. If revelation is true and reason is true, they must be harmonizable. He made a bold distinction between the three classes of people in relation to truth: the masses, who understand through symbols and stories; the theologians, who reason dialectically; and the philosophers, who grasp truth demonstratively through syllogisms and metaphysical clarity. For Averroes, philosophy was not for everyone, but it was essential for the well-being of the community because it cultivated wise leadership and protected against the abuse of religious authority. This nuanced approach came at a cost. Toward the end of his life, Averroes fell out of favor with political elites in Andalusia. His books were banned in parts of the Muslim world, and he was exiled. Yet his ideas had already begun a new journey, one that would cross into Latin Christendom and shape the very foundations of European scholasticism. Translated into Latin in the 13th century, Averroes' works arrived in Europe at a time when scholars were rediscovering ancient Greek texts, often through Arabic intermediaries. His commentaries on Aristotle became central texts at universities like Paris and Bologna. So influential was his interpretation that he was often referred to simply as the commentator, just as Aristotle was known as the philosopher. This sobriquet reflected the high regard in which he was held by medieval thinkers, particularly those wrestling with questions about the nature of the soul, the eternity of the world, and the relationship between reason and revelation. One such thinker was Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic theologian of the 13th century. Though Aquinas ultimately disagreed with Averroes on key issues, such as the doctrine of the unity of the intellect, he deeply respected his method and rigor. In fact, Averroes' insistence on the rational structure of the cosmos and his efforts to reconcile revelation with human logic influenced Aquinas' own monumental synthesis of Aristotle and Christian doctrine, particularly in his Summa Theologica. It is important to note that Averroes was not simply a transmitter of Aristotle. In engaging with Aristotelian thought, he reinterpreted and at times innovated. His articulation of the double truth theory, the notion that there can be two kinds of truth, one of faith and one of reason, was controversial, and later thinkers would wrestle with its implications for centuries. For some, it represented the beginning of secularism. For others, a dangerous bifurcation of spiritual and intellectual life. But for Averroes, it was a way to respect both the divine and the rational, without forcing them into artificial conformity. Today, Averroes is remembered as a symbol of intellectual bridge building, a man who stood at the crossroads of civilizations and showed that dialogue across difference is not only possible, but necessary. In his life and work, we see a philosopher not content to live in one tradition alone, but committed to the idea that truth is universal and that reason is one of its most faithful servants. As the Islamic Golden Age began to wane under political and religious pressures, the legacy of its thinkers lived on, not only in manuscripts, but in the very structure of modern philosophical thought. Averroes, like Al-Farabi and Avicenna before him, held a mirror to both East and West, revealing not only what had been thought, but what could still be thought, if one dared to think freely. And in that daring, philosophy lived. In the quiet corridors of 13th-century monasteries and universities, where monks copied manuscripts by candlelight and debates echoed through stone halls, one man emerged as the towering intellectual figure of medieval Christian thought, Thomas Aquinas. Born in 1225 in the Kingdom of Sicily, Aquinas would become one of the most profound theologians and philosophers in Western history, weaving together the threads of ancient Greek reason and Christian revelation into a tapestry of astonishing intellectual elegance. Thomas Aquinas lived in a time of immense intellectual ferment. Europe was undergoing a rediscovery of classical philosophy, particularly the works of Aristotle, which had been preserved and commented upon by Islamic philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes. These works had begun to circulate in Latin translations and were causing waves across the theological academies of Europe. For some, Aristotle's naturalistic and rational framework seemed to challenge Christian dogma. But for Aquinas, this ancient Greek thinker was not a threat, but a companion in the quest for truth. He believed that faith and reason were not enemies, but rather two wings by which the human spirit could rise toward the contemplation of God. This belief formed the basis of his great intellectual project, the synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. Unlike many of his contemporaries who might choose between philosophy and revelation, Aquinas sought to harmonize them. In his view, truths discovered through reason and those revealed by Scripture could not ultimately conflict, for both came from the same divine source. His guiding principle was that grace does not destroy nature but perfects it, meaning that the supernatural truths of Christianity build upon rather than override the natural truths accessible through human reason. The culmination of Aquinas' thought is found in his magnum opus, the Summa Theologica, a massive and unfinished work intended as a comprehensive guide to theology for students and scholars. But the Summa is not just a theological manual, it is a majestic architectural blueprint of the universe as seen through the lens of faith and logic. It is arranged in a systematic format, presenting questions followed by objections, responses, and then a reasoned conclusion, a method known as the scholastic style, which has influenced academic discourse for centuries. In the Summa, Aquinas tackles nearly every conceivable question about existence, morality, the soul, the nature of God, and the structure of the cosmos. One of his most enduring contributions is his theory of natural law, which holds that there is a moral order written into the fabric of the universe, accessible not just through divine revelation, but also through reason. According to Aquinas, all human beings, regardless of culture or creed, have the ability to discern right from wrong through the proper use of reason. This idea would go on to shape not only Christian ethics, but also the development of modern human rights theory and legal philosophy. Another cornerstone of Aquinas' philosophy is his understanding of God's order and causality. Drawing upon Aristotle's concept of the unmoved mover, Aquinas offered his famous 5 ways, rational arguments for the existence of God, each based on observable phenomena like motion, causation, and contingency. These arguments did not rely on scripture, but on empirical reasoning, and they were designed to demonstrate that belief in a creator was not a matter of blind faith, but of logical necessity. Perhaps most striking, however, is Aquinas' humility in the face of mystery. Despite his monumental intellect and prolific output, toward the end of his life, after experiencing a mystical vision during Mass, he ceased writing altogether. He told his companions, "All that I have written seems like straw compared to what I have seen." These words do not diminish the value of his work, but rather remind us that for Aquinas, knowledge was always a path, not a possession, a means of drawing closer to the divine mystery that lies beyond human comprehension. Aquinas' legacy is vast. In the Catholic tradition, he is revered as a doctor of the Church, and his works remain foundational in seminaries and theological faculties around the world. But his influence extends far beyond religious institutions. His methods of dialectical reasoning and his insistence on the compatibility of faith and reason have left a lasting imprint on Western thought, shaping disciplines as varied as law, ethics, education, and political philosophy. To study Aquinas is not merely to explore the mind of a medieval thinker, but to step into a world where intellect and spirit converge, where the deepest questions of existence are pursued not through shouting or certainty, but through calm inquiry and reverent curiosity. He reminds us that philosophy, when joined with faith, becomes something more than abstract speculation. It becomes a way of loving truth, of ordering one's soul, and of seeking a harmony that mirrors the divine. And so, in the gentle glow of history's long evening, Thomas Aquinas stands not just as a theologian or philosopher, but as a guide, showing that understanding, when grounded in both reverence and reason, becomes its own kind of prayer. To understand the enduring legacy of Thomas Aquinas is to appreciate how a single mind, deeply rooted in both faith and reason, could shape the spiritual and intellectual framework of an entire civilization. In the long history of Christian thought, Aquinas occupies a place of towering significance, not simply as a theologian, but as the most influential philosopher-theologian of medieval Europe. His synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine didn't merely guide his contemporaries. It redefined the nature of theology and moral philosophy for centuries to come, and his voice still echoes in the ethical and doctrinal debates of today. Aquinas rose to prominence at a moment when the Church was at the height of its institutional power and scholasticism was flourishing in medieval universities. These centers of learning, from Paris to Bologna, were attempting to systematize the Christian worldview in response to new intellectual challenges. Into this scene stepped Aquinas, a Dominican friar with a contemplative heart and a razor-sharp intellect. He possessed not only a vast knowledge of scripture and church tradition, but also an unmatched command of Greek philosophy, particularly the works of Aristotle, which were being rediscovered in the Latin West, largely through Islamic scholars. What made Aquinas truly remarkable was his capacity to integrate, to draw together disparate strands of thought into a coherent system that would support both doctrine and ethical reasoning. While some church leaders were suspicious of pagan philosophy, Aquinas demonstrated, through rigorous argument and unwavering faith, that truth, wherever it is found, ultimately points back to God. This insight allowed him to establish a new standard for theological inquiry, one that respected the authority of divine revelation, yet embraced the use of reason as a gift from God. This balance of faith and reason became the hallmark of Aquinas' legacy. His magnum opus, the Summa Theologica, stands not only as a monumental achievement in theology, but as the bedrock of Catholic doctrinal instruction. In its pages, he outlined the major tenets of Christian belief, from the nature of God and the Trinity, to the person of Christ, to the sacraments, angels, sin, and salvation. But perhaps most influential of all was his treatment of moral theology, where he laid the foundation for a Christian understanding of ethics that was grounded not in fear or rigidity, but in the flourishing of human nature. Central to Aquinas' moral philosophy is the concept of natural law. He argued that just as physical laws govern the material world, there is a moral law inscribed in human nature, an order that human beings can discern through reason. This natural law, for Aquinas, was a reflection of divine reason. It provides the framework by which we know what is good. Actions that fulfill the purpose of our nature, such as preserving life, seeking truth, living in society, are good. Those that undermine it are not. This idea was radical in its clarity and accessibility. It meant that morality wasn't reserved only for the clergy or theologians. It was available to every person, regardless of faith, through the use of reason. From this foundation, Aquinas articulated an entire system of ethics, built around the cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude, and the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. These were not abstract ideals, but qualities to be cultivated through practice and grace, guiding each individual toward their final end, union with God. Unlike rigid moralism, Aquinas' ethics is teleological. It asks what kind of life brings about human flourishing, and what kind of actions draw us nearer to truth, love, and God. In the centuries that followed, Aquinas' work became the standard against which all Catholic theology was measured. By the 16th century, the Council of Trent had declared his theology essential to the education of priests. In the modern era, Pope Leo XIII would revive Thomistic thought through the 1879 encyclical Aeterni Patris, making Aquinas' work the cornerstone of Catholic philosophy once again. To this day, his insights are studied not only in seminaries, but in law schools, philosophy departments, and ethical commissions around the world. But Aquinas' legacy isn't confined to the Catholic Church. His work has deeply influenced secular moral theory as well. Thinkers across religious and philosophical lines have drawn upon his ideas about natural law and moral reasoning, particularly in the realms of human rights, social justice, and legal theory. His clarity of structure, his appeal to reason, and his commitment to human dignity make his work perennially relevant in discussions about justice, ethics, and human purpose. In a time when faith is often pitted against reason and morality is treated as either purely subjective or rigidly dogmatic, Thomas Aquinas offers a third way, a path of integrity, balance, and harmony. He reminds us that belief need not be blind, and that reason, when rightly ordered, leads us not away from the divine, but closer to it. His work invites us to see knowledge as a sacred act, thinking as a form of worship, and morality as a path not only to social order, but to inner transformation. As the candles of medieval Europe flickered through long nights of contemplation, Aquinas' words lit a brighter flame, one that continues to illuminate the corridors of philosophy, theology, and ethics even now. His was not just the voice of a scholar, but the enduring wisdom of a soul who sought, above all, to understand the divine pattern within the world and within ourselves. In the quiet study of a 17th-century thinker, with the world embroiled in political turmoil and scientific revolution, a new kind of certainty was born. From this introspective silence emerged a phrase that would ripple through the foundations of philosophy: cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. With those 5 Latin words, René Descartes reshaped Western thought, not by building on inherited truths, but by tearing them down to the bedrock of awareness itself. Descartes lived in an era of profound transformation. The old certainties of medieval scholasticism, grounded in church doctrine and Aristotelian logic, were beginning to crumble under the weight of new discoveries. The telescope had opened the heavens, and the printing press had democratized knowledge. Wars of religion had fractured Christendom, and thinkers across Europe were asking fundamental questions about truth, authority, and knowledge. In this intellectual climate, Descartes offered something radically bold, a new method of thinking grounded in doubt, not faith, in reason, not revelation. His most famous statement, "I think, therefore I am," was not meant as a triumphant declaration, but as a quiet realization, discovered in solitude. Descartes was not trying to prove his existence to the world. He was trying to find something he could not doubt, something immune to deception, illusions, or even dreams. He asked, what if everything I see, hear, and touch is a lie? What if a malicious force is tricking me into believing in a world that doesn't exist? And yet, even in the depth of that skepticism, one thing remained undeniable. The very act of doubting proves that something, someone, is doing the doubting. I can be deceived, he wrote, but to be deceived, I must exist. Thus, the thinking self becomes the first certainty, not the body, not the senses, not external reality, but consciousness itself. This insight marked a turning point in Western philosophy. Before Descartes, Truth was often sought in the external world or in divine revelation. Descartes turned the gaze inward and laid the foundation for modern subjectivity, the idea that knowledge must begin with the self. From this starting point, he hoped to rebuild all of knowledge like a geometric proof, step by careful step. This approach became known as Cartesian doubt, a methodological skepticism that does not aim to destroy knowledge but to purify it. Descartes believed that by doubting everything that could possibly be doubted, he could arrive at truths that were absolutely indubitable, truths as firm as the axioms of geometry. It was not an exercise in despair, but one in construction, tearing down the house of belief to lay a more secure foundation. In his seminal work, Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes invites the reader to follow this inward journey. He discards the senses, since they can deceive. He discards the body, which might be a projection of the mind. He even questions mathematical truths, suggesting that a powerful deceiver could manipulate them. But eventually he arrives again at the cogito, the unshakable core. From there, he seeks to prove the existence of God and then the external world, all through a chain of reasoning that stems from this original certainty. Descartes' influence did not stop at metaphysics. His approach revolutionized epistemology, the study of how we know what we know. He helped usher in the age of reason, paving the way for Enlightenment thinkers like Spinoza, Leibniz, and Kant. His emphasis on clear and distinct ideas inspired new approaches in mathematics and science. Indeed, Descartes himself contributed to geometry and physics. The Cartesian coordinate system, which now bears his name, remains foundational in mathematics to this day. But perhaps Descartes' most lasting contribution was his vision of the human being, not as a passive recipient of knowledge, but as an active seeker of truth. The mind, for Descartes, was a tool capable of infinite precision and clarity, provided it followed the right method. In a world increasingly dominated by uncertainty, political, religious, scientific, he offered a blueprint for clarity, beginning not with the cosmos, but with the self. And yet, Descartes' legacy is not without its complexities. His insistence on the primacy of reason also led to what some later philosophers called the problem of the split, the division of mind and body, thought and feeling, self and world. His radical doubt, while illuminating, created a dualism that subsequent thinkers like Spinoza, Hume, and later phenomenologists would wrestle to dissolve. But that tension between clarity and doubt, between self and world, remains one of the most productive questions in philosophy. In the quiet solitude where Descartes wrote, far from courts and cathedrals, he showed that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with swords or sermons, but with a single sentence whispered in the stillness of thought. I think, therefore I am. A phrase so simple, yet so rich, that it continues to echo through every modern discussion of identity, knowledge, and existence. As we drift now into thought and rest, we carry with us this gentle reminder from Descartes, that in the act of wondering we affirm our being, that in questioning the world we come to know ourselves, and that sometimes certainty begins with doubt. After René Descartes arrived at his foundational truth, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, he faced a new question. What exactly is this I that thinks? What is the nature of the self that remains after everything else has been doubted? His answer gave rise to a philosophical doctrine that would shape centuries of thought: dualism, the notion that mind and body are two distinct substances, fundamentally different in nature and governed by separate laws. In Descartes' view, the mind was a thinking, non-material substance, invisible, indivisible, not extended in space. It was the seat of consciousness, thought, doubt, imagination, and judgment. The body, by contrast, was a material, mechanical thing, extended in space, governed by physical laws, and subject to the same forces as the stars and stones. This radical separation was not just an abstract distinction. It was Descartes' attempt to reconcile the subjective world of thought with the objective world of matter, and to grant each its own domain. This separation of mind and body, known as Cartesian dualism, was both a conceptual breakthrough and a lasting tension in Western philosophy. For Descartes, it solved the problem of certainty. Even if the physical world was in doubt, the thinking mind was not. And by categorizing the body as a machine, it opened the way for a mechanistic, scientific understanding of human physiology. But it also raised deep, unresolved questions. How do the immaterial mind and the physical body interact? Where does consciousness come from? Can thought influence matter? Descartes proposed that the connection between mind and body occurred in the pineal gland, a small structure in the center of the brain, which he believed was uniquely positioned to serve as the meeting point between soul and flesh. While modern neuroscience no longer supports this view, his attempt to localize the mind-body connection reflected his desire to bridge the divide he had so clearly drawn. Still, the questions he raised would echo through centuries, inspiring entire fields of inquiry, from psychology and neurology to metaphysics and artificial intelligence. Beyond the philosophical domain, Descartes' dualism had practical implications that were revolutionary in their time. By treating the body as a machine, he laid the foundation for the development of modern anatomy and physiology. Physicians and scientists could now study the body without being accused of heresy, because Descartes had clearly separated the soul, the domain of theology, from the body, the domain of science. In this way, his work helped liberate medicine and biology from ecclesiastical oversight, making space for observation, dissection, and empirical research. It was this same mechanistic view that influenced Isaac Newton, Galileo Galilei, and other early modern scientists who saw the universe not as a mysterious, God-infused order, but as a vast machine operating according to knowable laws. Descartes' mathematical precision, his insistence on clear and distinct ideas, and his focus on deductive reasoning shaped the rationalist tradition, which sought to explain the world through logic, geometry, and systematized doubt. His discourse on the method and meditations on first philosophy were not only philosophical works, but manifestos of intellectual independence. In a time still shadowed by religious orthodoxy and authoritarian structures, Descartes dared to assert that human reason, properly applied, could discover truths on its own. This assertion resonated deeply with the thinkers of the Enlightenment, who adopted his vision of a self-reliant intellect as a cornerstone of their own movements. Thinkers such as Baruch Spinoza, Gottfried Leibniz, and later Immanuel Kant would take Descartes' rationalist method as a point of departure, either building upon it or critiquing it. Even empiricists like John Locke and David Hume, who disagreed with Descartes on many points, were reacting to the new terrain he had cleared. Whether embraced or contested, Descartes' philosophy became the axis around which modern European thought began to rotate. In the broader cultural sense, Cartesian dualism also mirrored the growing belief in human autonomy. The idea that each person had an inner realm of thought that could not be dictated by outside forces. This idea would shape modern political thought, legal systems, and conceptions of individual rights. If the mind was private, free, and self-aware, then so too should be the citizen in a just society. Yet, dualism's legacy is not without critique. In more recent centuries, philosophers have pushed back against the rigid mind-body split. Phenomenologists, existentialists, and neuroscientists have all challenged the idea that consciousness and embodiment can be so neatly divided. The body, they argue, is not just a machine. It is integral to perception, emotion, and identity. And yet, even these critiques take Descartes as their starting point, proving that his ideas remain a central pivot in the history of thought. As we close this chapter, it's worth remembering that Descartes did not aim to create confusion or disunity. On the contrary, his was a quest for clarity, for a firm foundation upon which knowledge could be rebuilt. In drawing a line between mind and body, he allowed each to be studied with precision, respect, and rigor. And though the line may blur in today's science and philosophy, it was Descartes who first dared to draw it. Now, as we drift into sleep, we carry with us this image, a man seated alone by the fire, questioning all that he sees and hears, until at last he finds certainty not in the stars nor the scriptures, but in the quiet act of thinking itself. And from that quiet, an entire age of reason would rise. In the quiet town of Königsberg, nestled in what was once East Prussia, Immanuel Kant lived a life of such disciplined regularity that locals were said to set their watches by his afternoon walks. Yet within this modest clockwork existence, Kant's mind was anything but routine. He spent his life wrestling with the deepest puzzles of existence, questions of knowledge, morality, and the structure of human experience itself. And in doing so, he reshaped the philosophical landscape with a precision and depth that continue to reverberate through every major intellectual tradition today. Kant's most famous and formidable work, Critique of Pure Reason, 1781, was an attempt to reconcile the rationalist tradition of thinkers like Descartes and Leibniz with the empiricism of Locke and Hume. He believed both sides were partly right and partly wrong. The rationalists trusted reason to deduce truths independent of experience, while the empiricists claimed that all knowledge comes from sense perception. Kant asked, could these views be harmonized? To answer this, he embarked on what he famously called a Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus had shifted the center of the universe from the earth to the sun, Kant shifted the center of knowledge from the external world to the structure of the human mind. We do not, he argued, passively receive the world through our senses. Instead, our minds actively shape what we perceive. Space and time, for Kant, are not external realities. They are forms of intuition, structures through which we experience everything. Categories like causality, quantity, and unity aren't discovered in nature. They are mental frameworks we apply to the raw data of experience. In this light, the Critique of Pure Reason examines the limits of what we can know. There is a fundamental distinction between the phenomenal world, the world as we experience it, and the noumenal world, the world as it is in itself, beyond our perception. While science can tell us much about phenomena, Kant maintained that we can never truly know the noumenal, things as they exist independently of our minds. This was not a retreat into skepticism, but rather a humble boundary Kant placed on reason. For all its power, human understanding has edges it cannot cross. But where reason fails to reach in metaphysics, Kant turned to another domain: morality. If the theoretical use of reason was limited, the practical use, how we guide our actions, offered a foundation not grounded in perception but in rational principles. This brought Kant to one of his most enduring contributions: the categorical imperative. Unlike hypothetical imperatives, which are conditional, if you want X, then do Y, the categorical imperative is absolute. It commands moral action not because it leads to a result, but because it is right in itself. The most famous formulation goes, "Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." This deceptively simple test challenges us to universalize our intentions. If the rule behind our action could not be adopted by everyone without contradiction, then it is morally impermissible. For Kant, morality was not about consequences, emotions, or personal inclinations. It was about duty, the solemn obligation to respect rational beings as ends in themselves, never merely as means. Autonomy, the capacity for self-legislation through reason, was the foundation of dignity. To be moral was to be free, not free in the sense of doing whatever one pleased, but free in the higher sense of acting according to laws one gave to oneself through rational will. This concept of moral law, absolute, universal, and rooted in reason, was both austere and liberating. It placed the source of ethics not in divine command or social custom, but in the rational structure of human consciousness. Every person in this view carries within them a moral law akin to a compass, quietly guiding their sense of right and wrong. It was this inner law that Kant called the starry heavens above and the moral law within, a phrase he found awe-inspiring. Kant's moral philosophy was deeply egalitarian. If moral worth is based on rationality, then all rational beings are equally deserving of respect, regardless of status, wealth, or birth. This principle became a foundation for human rights discourse, influencing modern constitutions, declarations, and ethical theories across the world. As we rest our thoughts for now, Kant's voice lingers, calm, precise, and quietly revolutionary. He asked us to think deeply, not only about what we can know, but also about how we ought to live. In a universe that may be unknowable at its deepest levels, there remains for Kant something within us that is clear and luminous, the will to do good, guided by reason alone. In the next breath of history, we'll explore how these ideas of duty, reason, and respect evolved in the hands of philosophers who sought to challenge and expand them. But tonight, we let Kant's careful mind guide us into the stillness of ethical reflection. In the great debate that had split Enlightenment Europe, between the rationalists who believed reason alone could yield truth and the empiricists who trusted only the senses, Immanuel Kant stepped forward with a new proposition. Perhaps both were right and both were wrong. This was not a gesture of compromise, but a bold act of philosophical synthesis. It would come to define one of Kant's most enduring legacies, his reconciliation of empiricism and rationalism, two opposing pillars of thought that had defined the modern era. The rationalists, like Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, believed that the human mind could arrive at knowledge through pure reason, independent of sensory experience. Meanwhile, the empiricists, Locke, Berkeley, and most notably David Hume, argued that all knowledge comes through experience and that the mind begins as a blank slate. Kant agreed with the empiricists that knowledge begins with experience, but he also argued in a revolutionary twist that experience alone is not enough. The mind does not passively receive impressions from the world like a camera recording images. Instead, it actively structures that experience using built-in concepts, what he called the categories of understanding. These include notions like unity, causality, and necessity. Without them, experience would be a chaotic blur, unintelligible, and without meaning. Thus, in Kant's famous words, thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. With this single stroke, he fused the strengths of both traditions. From empiricism, he took the insight that our knowledge must be grounded in sensory experience. From rationalism, he preserved the idea that certain structures, like time, space, and causality, are not learned from experience, but are the preconditions for having any experience at all. This fusion was more than a clever compromise. It marked a turning point in the history of philosophy. It established the foundation for what would become transcendental idealism, Kant's view that we can only ever know the world as it appears to us, phenomena, shaped by the lens of human cognition, and not as it is in itself, noumena. In doing so, Kant didn't deny the existence of a reality beyond our perception. He simply insisted that it lies beyond the reach of pure reason and empirical inquiry alike. Kant's achievement here laid the groundwork for entire branches of modern thought, especially epistemology, the study of knowledge. Later philosophers, including Hegel, Schopenhauer, and the phenomenologists, would all grapple with and build upon his insights. In the 20th century, Kant's legacy was revived again by thinkers like Edmund Husserl and even by modern cognitive science, which likewise views perception as an active, interpretive process rather than passive reception. Beyond knowledge, however, Kant's influence reached deeply into ethics and political theory. His emphasis on autonomy, the idea that moral agents must be self-legislating, rational beings, redefined what it meant to live a moral life. For Kant, freedom was not the absence of constraint, but the capacity to act according to principles one gives to oneself through reason. This was a radical departure from morality rooted in divine command or social norms. This vision of moral autonomy underpinned Kant's famous defense of human dignity. Because each rational being is capable of moral reasoning, each deserves respect, not because of their rank, utility, or power, but simply by virtue of being human. This principle would become foundational to modern human rights, constitutional democracies, and liberal political thought. It echoes in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and reverberates in modern debates about justice, equality, and liberty. Kant's political philosophy, while not as systematized as his ethics, reflected the same values. He was a proponent of perpetual peace, envisioning a world order built not through conquest, but through rational cooperation between states. He imagined a federation of nations governed by laws, mutual respect, and shared moral obligations. His essay Toward Perpetual Peace is often cited as a precursor to the idea of the United Nations and a forerunner of cosmopolitan political theory. Even today, Kant's categorical imperative shapes debates about ethics in technology, artificial intelligence, and bioethics. His strict focus on intention, principle, and universalizability serves as a counterpoint to utilitarianism and consequentialist thinking. In a world obsessed with outcomes and efficiency, Kant reminds us that how we act and why matters as much as what we achieve. In his lifetime, Kant never traveled far from Königsberg, yet through his works he ventured deeper into the recesses of human thought than most ever do. He showed that the mind is not simply a mirror of nature, but a participant in the construction of reality, and he insisted that, even in a world of uncertainty, there is one place where reason can still stand firm: in our duty to one another. As we drift forward into the next chapter, we carry with us Kant's quiet, rational clarity, his unwavering belief that the human mind, while limited, is also deeply noble, and that in our ability to think, to act morally, and to question without fear, we find a freedom that no tyrant or chaos can take away. As we continue our quiet journey through the minds that have shaped our understanding of the human condition, we arrive at a new kind of philosopher, one whose questions begin not in abstract metaphysics or divine logic, but in the lived experiences of women. It is here, in the overlooked silence of drawing rooms, classrooms, and political chambers, that feminist philosophy began to emerge, not as a rebellion against reason, but as a long overdue extension of it. The story begins with Mary Wollstonecraft, writing in the turbulent shadows of the French Revolution. It was 1792 when she published her defining work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. In a world that accepted the subjugation of women as a natural order, Wollstonecraft dared to ask, what if women were not inferior by nature, but simply denied the tools of reason? She argued that the supposed fragility and frivolity of women were not innate flaws, but the inevitable result of poor education and societal conditioning. Denied access to serious intellectual development, women were encouraged instead to cultivate beauty, charm, and obedience, the traits most prized in wives and mothers. This, Wollstonecraft believed, reduced them to mere ornaments of society, incapable of the full moral and intellectual development afforded to men. But Wollstonecraft's vision was not one of mere parity in social roles. It was a philosophical affirmation of equality through reason. If reason is the highest human faculty, and if morality requires rational deliberation, then to deny women the same intellectual nourishment as men was not only unjust, but irrational. True virtue, she claimed, must be grounded in autonomy, not subservience, and without education there could be no autonomy. In her time, Wollstonecraft was both celebrated and scorned. Some saw her as the harbinger of a new social order. Others dismissed her as dangerous and unwomanly. Yet her argument, rooted in Enlightenment ideals of liberty and rationality, planted a seed that would take more than a century to fully bloom. Her insistence that women must be seen as rational beings capable of self-governance echoed into the later works of John Stuart Mill, Virginia Woolf, and eventually Simone de Beauvoir. More than 150 years later, in post-war France, Simone de Beauvoir picked up that thread and wove it into one of the most important philosophical works of the 20th century, The Second Sex, 1949. At once literary, philosophical, and fiercely political. It was a wide-ranging exploration of what it means to live as a woman in a world built by and for men. Her most famous line, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman," captures the essence of her thought. For de Beauvoir, womanhood was not simply a biological category, but a social and existential project. From infancy, girls are taught to see themselves as other, as second to the universal male subject. They are shaped by expectations, norms, and roles that limit their freedom and bind them to definitions not of their own making. Drawing on existentialist philosophy, de Beauvoir explored how women are often alienated from their own subjectivity. Whereas Sartre argued that all human beings are condemned to be free, that we must define ourselves through our actions, de Beauvoir showed how women are systematically discouraged from doing just that. They are taught to please, to wait, to support others' freedom rather than claim their own. Yet de Beauvoir did not call for a rejection of femininity itself. Rather, she urged women to reclaim it on their own terms. She believed that liberation would not come from mimicking men, but from recognizing and transcending the limiting roles assigned to women. It was a call not to abandon difference, but to make difference a choice rather than a prison. Where Wollstonecraft had argued for equality in reason, de Beauvoir argued for freedom in being. And though their languages were different, one rooted in Enlightenment rationalism, the other in existential ambiguity, both women were united in their demand for dignity, autonomy, and voice. Their ideas would ripple through the second-wave feminism of the 1960s and 70s, inspiring thinkers like Betty Friedan, Audre Lorde, and bell hooks. But beyond activism, Wollstonecraft and de Beauvoir redefined what philosophy itself could be. They expanded its domain to include the lived realities of gender and identity, insisting that the private sphere was not separate from the philosophical. It was the very soil in which ideas of freedom, power, and justice grew. As we continue this gentle exploration of great minds and their echoes through time, the current of existentialism continues to ripple through the life and work of Simone de Beauvoir, but now deepens into the philosophical waters where gender and being confront each other directly. Existentialism, with its insistence on freedom, individual responsibility, and the absence of predetermined essence, provided a framework unlike any before it. And in the hands of de Beauvoir, it became not just a philosophy of the human condition, but a radical lens through which to examine womanhood itself. At the heart of existentialist thought lies the premise that existence precedes essence, that we are not born with a fixed identity or purpose, but must create it ourselves through our actions and choices. For de Beauvoir, this principle was not merely abstract. It was a revolutionary insight with direct implications for how gender operates in the world. A woman is not born to be nurturing, submissive, or vain. She becomes those things, if she does, through a socialization process that denies her full freedom. Yet freedom in existentialist terms is not given. It is seized, often in the face of anguish and uncertainty. And so, de Beauvoir does not idealize freedom as a simple liberation. Instead, she paints a complex picture. Women, like all humans, are free in theory, but in practice are weighed down by centuries of cultural, religious, and familial expectation. Their freedom has been interrupted by the gaze of the other, and this too becomes central to her analysis. In existentialism, The concept of the other, developed by philosophers like Hegel, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty, refers to the way human beings define themselves in contrast to what they are not. For de Beauvoir, this framework illuminated the relationship between men and women. Men had, for centuries, defined themselves as the universal subject, the standard of humanity. Women, by contrast, were the other, not fully autonomous subjects in their own right, but relative beings, defined by their roles as wives, mothers, muses, temptresses. This othering was not just a psychological phenomenon, it was structural. It determined women's access to education, to careers, to property, even to selfhood. And yet, even in the midst of this imposed position, de Beauvoir insisted that women were still free, or rather, still responsible. That was the heavy gift existentialism handed to all people, regardless of their circumstances. We are condemned to be free, Sartre wrote, and de Beauvoir agreed. Even when the world limits our options, we are responsible for how we respond. It is here that her vision becomes deeply ethical. She does not merely critique patriarchy as an external system. She asks how women, too, have sometimes participated in their own limitation, often out of fear, comfort, or habit. And yet, this critique is not cruel. It is infused with empathy, even sadness. The problem, she says, is not that women lack the capacity for freedom, but that they have too rarely been encouraged, or even allowed, to use it. Freedom, for de Beauvoir, was not just the right to vote or own property. It was the ability to transcend, to move beyond one's given situation, to define oneself through projects, choices, and the creation of meaning. But this kind of freedom demanded not only political change, but existential courage. Her influence would stretch far beyond the cafes of post-war Paris. In the decades to come, her work laid the philosophical groundwork for feminist existentialism, a tradition that would be carried forward by thinkers like Iris Marion Young, who analyzed how the female body is experienced in space, and Judith Butler, who interrogated the performativity of gender and the instability of identity itself. Simone de Beauvoir's vision also extended into practical political activism. She campaigned for women's reproductive rights, critiqued the institution of marriage, and challenged not only traditional gender roles, but the very assumptions beneath them. Yet she never abandoned her philosophical commitments. She believed that personal liberation was always intertwined with collective responsibility, that freedom, to be real, must be shared. Today, her thought continues to inspire not only feminists, but all who seek to understand how identity is shaped, how systems of power operate, and how ethical responsibility begins with the self, but never ends there. She taught us that to be human is to face the void, but also to build bridges across it with others through solidarity and shared struggle. As we prepare to move forward in our reflective journey, the questions de Beauvoir leaves us with remain alive. What does it mean to be free in a world that tries to define you before you speak? How can we live authentically, not just as individuals, but in community with others? And perhaps most of all, how do we take responsibility for the world we inherit and the one we shape quietly each day? As our journey through the world of philosophy winds into the shadowy, dramatic contours of the late 19th century, we arrive at the figure of Friedrich Nietzsche, a man who described his thinking as philosophizing with a hammer. Not a hammer of destruction, but of testing, striking the idols of Western thought to hear which ones rang hollow. In the stillness of nighttime reflection, Nietzsche's ideas may not soothe in the way a lullaby might, but they call to a deeper kind of wakefulness, one that lives beneath the surface of dreams. Born in 1844 in Röcken, a small village in what is now Germany, Nietzsche was a prodigy in classical philology before he turned his gaze to philosophy. By his mid-20s, he was appointed a professor at the University of Basel. But poor health and spiritual restlessness pushed him away from academia and into an itinerant life of writing, often in solitude, often in pain, yet always with fierce intellectual clarity. It was in this solitude that he produced some of the most penetrating critiques of the foundations of Western morality, religion, and conformity. Nietzsche did not see morality as eternal or absolute. He saw it as historical, shaped by cultures, by power structures, and above all, by psychology. In works like On the Genealogy of Morality and Beyond Good and Evil, he explored the idea that what we consider good and evil are not fixed truths, but interpretations, and often interpretations born of resentment. He distinguished between master morality and slave morality. The former, rooted in strength, confidence, and self-affirmation, was the morality of those who create values. The latter, born from weakness and envy, inverted these values, elevating humility and meekness as moral virtues and branding power and pride as sinful. Nowhere did Nietzsche's hammer strike more loudly than in his declaration that God is dead. But this statement was not a triumphant cheer. It was a lament, a warning, a mirror held up to the modern soul. What he meant was that the traditional metaphysical and religious foundations of Western civilization, Christianity above all, were losing their grip. Science, secularism, and modernity had dethroned the old gods, but nothing had been built in their place. Without the moral scaffolding of faith, Nietzsche believed, Europe faced a spiritual crisis. The death of God was not an event to celebrate, but a profound existential challenge. Without divine order, where would meaning come from? It is here that Nietzsche introduced one of his most enduring and misunderstood concepts, the will to power. This was not, as some have caricatured, a crude thirst for domination. Rather, Nietzsche saw the will to power as the fundamental drive in all life, the urge not simply to survive, but to grow, to assert, to create. It was a metaphysical and psychological principle, explaining everything from artistic creation to ethical revaluation. Where others sought comfort or stasis, Nietzsche exalted overcoming, a perpetual becoming, a transformation of the self. Closely tied to this was his vision of the Übermensch, often translated as the Overman or Superman. This was not a blueprint for a new ruling class, but a symbol, an ideal figure who could create values in a godless world. The Übermensch does not rely on external authorities or traditions, but draws meaning from within, forging a path guided by authenticity and strength of spirit. He stands alone, not in arrogance, but in responsibility. And then there was eternal recurrence, perhaps Nietzsche's most haunting and poetic thought experiment. Imagine, he asks, that your life, exactly as you have lived it, would be repeated again and again for eternity. Would you say yes to that life? Would you embrace it, every joy and every sorrow, again and again? This idea was not meant to be taken literally, but as a test of one's relationship with existence. Could we live in such a way that we would welcome life's repetition, not as a burden, but as an affirmation? Nietzsche's writing style, aphoristic, lyrical, sometimes fiery, reflected his philosophical temperament. He did not build neat systems. He provoked, challenged, and illuminated. He sought not to hand out answers, but to awaken the reader to the radical task of creating meaning in a world without inherent direction. In the final years of his life, Nietzsche succumbed to mental illness, and he never recovered. Yet even in his collapse, his work took on a life of its own, often misinterpreted, sometimes abused, but also deeply cherished by artists, writers, psychologists, and seekers of all kinds. His critique of herd mentality, his embrace of individual becoming, and his suspicion of absolute truths continue to resonate. To read Nietzsche, even quietly before sleep, is not to be comforted but to be stirred, not to be told what to think, but to be reminded of the responsibility that comes with thinking. He reminds us that meaning is not found but made, and that each of us, in our solitude, must decide what it means to live fully, bravely, and freely. Among all of Nietzsche's works, none looms larger in terms of mystique, passion, and poetic force than Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Published in parts between 1883 and 1885, it was not a typical philosophical treatise. Rather, it was a lyrical, allegorical narrative, part sermon, part myth, part philosophical thunderstorm, that introduced some of his most enduring and challenging ideas. The book follows the fictional prophet Zarathustra, a hermit who descends from his mountain solitude to share his teachings with humanity. But unlike Moses bearing commandments, Zarathustra offers no easy truths, only provocations, riddles, and echoes of ancient wisdom reimagined for a world in crisis. Written in a style inspired by the Bible, but stripped of its divine authority, the text is structured as a series of parables, visions, and speeches. Nietzsche's choice of Zarathustra, named after the Persian religious reformer Zoroaster, was deliberate. He saw Zoroaster as the first to posit a cosmic dualism of good versus evil. In Nietzsche's telling, Zarathustra returns not to reinforce this morality, but to overcome it. The prophet now brings fire not from the heavens, but from within the self, urging a spiritual transformation without gods. Central to Thus Spoke Zarathustra is the idea of the Übermensch, the overman or beyond man, first introduced in this text. For Nietzsche, the Übermensch is not a political ruler or a superhuman being, but an ideal toward which humanity might strive. He stands beyond the binary of good and evil, beyond herd values and conformity, beyond the illusions of eternal reward. This figure creates his own values and affirms life even in its harshest moments. Zarathustra does not command his listeners to believe in this figure, but to become him, to embrace life with artistic courage, to shape existence like a sculptor with clay. Thus, Spoke Zarathustra also expands upon Nietzsche's haunting thought experiment of eternal recurrence. The idea that one must live as if every action, every moment, would return infinitely. When Zarathustra shares this revelation, he trembles under its weight. It is not simply a metaphysical puzzle, it is a measure of one's capacity to say yes to life, to affirm life so fully that one would relive it forever. That is the ultimate test of one's vitality, integrity, and acceptance of existence. The book is filled with soaring language and stark imagery. There are dancing stars, serpents and eagles, tightrope walkers, and deep silences between sentences. Nietzsche was not writing to instruct, but to inspire, provoke, and unsettle. He described Zarathustra as the most profound book humanity possesses. Yet even he admitted that it was not easily understood. It was meant to be lived with, struggled with, a kind of spiritual training for the soul. Unfortunately, the brilliance of Zarathustra did not prevent its dangerous misappropriation in the 20th century, especially in the lead-up to and during the rise of fascism in Europe. Nietzsche's sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, a nationalist and sympathizer of the far right, took it upon herself to edit and publish his works after his mental collapse. In doing so, she distorted many of his writings to align them with proto-fascist ideals, especially during the Nazi regime in Germany. The concept of the Übermensch was twisted into a justification for racial superiority, a grotesque betrayal of Nietzsche's intentions. The Nazis cherry-picked phrases and stripped them of their context, presenting Nietzsche as a prophet of domination and cruelty. In reality, Nietzsche despised nationalism, anti-Semitism, and authoritarianism. He was scathing in his criticism of the German Empire, of anti-Semitic thinkers, and of any collectivist ideology that erased individual thought. Similarly, his famous proclamation that God is dead was not a declaration of atheism's triumph, but a recognition of cultural loss, the collapse of meaning structures without anything sufficient to replace them. Nietzsche feared the vacuum this would leave, and indeed the political upheavals of the 20th century bore out many of his darkest premonitions. He predicted a century marked by nihilism and ideological extremism, a spiritual crisis that would demand a new kind of human being to overcome. But despite these misuses, Nietzsche's true voice has endured. Philosophers, artists, psychologists, and poets have returned to "Thus spoke Zarathustra" not as a dogma, but as a challenge, to reawaken their own moral intuitions, to craft meaning out of chaos, and to listen more carefully to the subtle music of becoming. Carl Jung drew heavily on Nietzsche's archetypes in his analytical psychology. Martin Heidegger explored the metaphysical depths of Nietzsche's thought in his lectures. And modern existentialists found in Zarathustra not certainty, but courage. Even outside the academy, Nietzsche's poetic vision has had wide cultural impact. His themes echo in novels, films, and even popular music. Stanley Kubrick famously used Richard Strauss's "Also sprach Zarathustra," inspired by Nietzsche's book, in the opening of 2001, A Space Odyssey. The swelling brass chords and rising tension are a fitting tribute to the philosopher who called humanity to surpass itself. And so, as we close this chapter, we do not leave Nietzsche with the comfort of clear answers, but with the echo of Zarathustra's call. You must be ready to burn yourself in your own flame. How could you rise anew if you have not first become ashes? It is a philosophy not of sleep, but of awakening, not of doctrine, but of dancing with life, boldly, dangerously, beautifully. As the 20th century burned through 2 world wars, and the moral anchors of society wavered, existentialism emerged not as a doctrine, but as a lifeline for those trying to make sense of meaning in a fractured world. Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher, novelist, playwright, and public intellectual, became one of its most influential voices. With his penetrating mind and unrelenting commitment to intellectual honesty, Sartre did not offer comfort. He offered clarity, however uncomfortable. His core message was startling in its simplicity. Humans are radically free, and with that freedom comes radical responsibility. Sartre's magnum opus, Being and Nothingness, 1943, is one of the densest and most challenging works of modern philosophy. Written while he was a prisoner of war during World War II and published shortly after, it is a sweeping analysis of human consciousness, freedom, and the anxiety that arises when we confront our own role in shaping reality. Sartre builds on the phenomenological tradition of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, but sharpens it into a confrontation with human freedom. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre distinguishes between two modes of being: being in itself, en soi, which characterizes inanimate objects, fixed and without consciousness, and being for itself, pour soi, which defines human consciousness, dynamic, self-aware, and always in the process of becoming. The human being, in Sartre's view, is never a static entity. We are not things. We are always in motion, always transcending what we were a moment ago. Consciousness is, at its core, nothingness, not in a nihilistic sense, but as a space of freedom and possibility. This conception of freedom is not light or celebratory. It is, as Sartre puts it, a condemned freedom. We are not free because we chose to be. We are free whether we like it or not. There is no divine blueprint, no fixed human nature to fall back on. And so we are left to create ourselves through our choices, our actions, and our commitments. With this idea, Sartre famously declared that existence precedes essence. Unlike a knife, whose essence, its purpose, function, and design, is established before it is made, human beings exist first and define themselves afterward. This principle shattered centuries of philosophical and religious assumptions about human nature. Sartre argued that we are not born with a preordained essence, not with souls, not with divine plans, not even with a universal morality. Each person is responsible for inventing who they are through lived experience, but this responsibility is daunting. In fact, Sartre believed that much of human behavior, from bad faith, mauvaise foi, to societal conformity, stems from our attempts to escape this burden. Bad faith, one of Sartre's most enduring concepts, refers to the ways in which people deceive themselves to avoid the anxiety of freedom. Consider the waiter who rigidly plays his role, overly concerned with being the perfect waiter. Sartre would say he is not simply performing his duties, he is trying to be a waiter in the same way a rock is a rock. But humans cannot be fully defined by roles. The waiter is hiding from his freedom, pretending he is a thing with a fixed identity rather than a person capable of transcending roles. This theme is brought to life in Sartre's most famous play, No Exit, 1944, in which three characters are locked in a room together for eternity. There are no flames or demons, just other people judging eyes and memories that cannot be escaped. As one character famously proclaims, hell is other people. This is not a misanthropic claim, but a reflection on how the gaze of the other can trap us. We begin to see ourselves through others' judgments, losing the authenticity of self-definition. Sartre was warning us. Freedom must be exercised even under scrutiny, even in discomfort. His existentialism resonated deeply with a post-war generation seeking meaning in the ruins of old ideologies. Sartre's belief that human beings are not what they are, but what they make of themselves, became a rallying cry for artists, writers, and activists. He rejected the notion of fate. For him, passivity in the face of injustice was an abdication of one's humanity. During the Algerian War, the Vietnam War, and various colonial struggles, Sartre spoke out, not because he believed he had the answer, but because he believed it was his responsibility to act. Despite being offered the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1964, Sartre refused it. His reason was deeply consistent with his philosophical stance. He didn't want to be turned into an institution. He believed that accepting the prize would compromise his independence as a writer. It was a rare moment when philosophy and personal integrity walked in perfect sync. Jean-Paul Sartre's vision of the human condition is not a philosophical abstraction meant to be admired from afar. It is a call to live, to choose, and to take responsibility for who we become. For Sartre, existence is not something given, it is something built moment by moment through our choices and actions. We are, in his famous formulation, condemned to be free, and in that freedom lies both our potential and our burden. This is perhaps one of the most radical departures from earlier philosophies that sought security in divine providence, social roles, or predetermined essences. Sartre insists, we are what we do. To understand Sartre's claim that human beings are self-defining through action, one must appreciate the weight he places on lived experience. For Sartre, we are not born with a soul that contains our nature, nor are we shaped by fate or biology alone. We are, instead, the sum of our decisions. A person who chooses cowardice, for example, is not simply afflicted with cowardice. They are a coward because they continually choose to act in ways that avoid confrontation or fear. A brave person is one who acts bravely, not one who possesses bravery as a fixed attribute. This focus on action means that identity is never stable or finalized. We are always in the process of becoming. Unlike a chair, which remains a chair regardless of whether anyone sits in it, a human being only becomes something through the meanings we assign and the actions we take. If you claim to be honest but habitually lie, then you are not an honest person in Sartre's world. You are the choices you enact. In this way, Sartre's existentialism is fiercely ethical, though without offering universal rules. It demands integrity, not from obedience to law, but from authenticity, choosing freely and taking full ownership of what those choices say about who you are. But Sartre was acutely aware that this level of freedom can be terrifying. After all, if nothing beyond ourselves gives our lives meaning, not God, not tradition, not reason, then we are alone with the task of crafting our existence. This is where the tension between freedom and despair emerges. The very thing that liberates us, our radical freedom, is also what leaves us most vulnerable to anguish, guilt, and despair. Despair, for Sartre, is not just sadness. It is the emotional result of recognizing that we cannot rely on external forces to determine our values or outcomes. Imagine a person hoping that someone else will love them, or that a political movement will succeed, or that their talent will be recognized. Sartre would caution that such hope is fine. But despair sets in when we expect the world to behave in a certain way and build our identity on that expectation. Despair, then, is realizing that we must act in a world that offers no guarantees. It is knowing that even the most righteous actions might not bear fruit, and yet choosing to act anyway. In this regard, freedom is deeply linked to anxiety. Sartre called it anguish. The realization that, in choosing for ourselves, we are choosing for all of humanity. Our actions are not isolated. They affirm what we believe humans should be. If I choose courage in a moment of fear, I am implicitly stating that courage is a value worth choosing, not just for me, but as an example. The full gravity of that freedom is dizzying. One of Sartre's most illustrative examples is that of a young man during World War II faced with a moral dilemma: stay and care for his sick mother or leave to join the resistance against Nazi occupation. No moral rule, religious commandment, or philosophical system can tell him what to do. He must choose, and in choosing, he defines who he is. There is no escape from this responsibility, not even in silence or indecision, which are themselves choices. Sartre's view of despair is not hopelessness. It is, paradoxically, a kind of truthfulness. To acknowledge despair is to acknowledge the limits of what we can control, while still embracing the necessity to act. In this way, despair becomes a condition for authentic living, not a pitfall to be avoided. One does not escape despair by clinging to illusions or outsourcing responsibility. One transcends it by facing reality and acting with awareness. Thus, Sartre's existentialism is not a philosophy of nihilism, but one of intense moral demand. It does not tell us what to do, but it does tell us that we must do something, and that in every act we are inscribing meaning into the world. We are not passive observers of life, waiting for meaning to arrive. We are its authors, and the pen is always in our hands. In the quiet spaces between breaths and decisions, Sartre asks us to reflect not on who we are, but on who we are becoming. And in that becoming, we find both the fear of freedom and the courage it demands. As the 20th century unfolded, bearing witness to 2 world wars, totalitarian regimes, nuclear threats, and mass disillusionment, the work of philosophers no longer revolved around abstract metaphysics alone. A deep sense of crisis infused their thought. It was no longer simply a matter of questioning knowledge or justice in the classical sense. Instead, the question became, how do we live in a world that no longer makes sense? In this chapter, we explore 2 towering figures of modern philosophy, Albert Camus and Hannah Arendt, who each, in their own way, confronted this question with unsparing clarity and profound insight. Albert Camus, 1913 to 1960, born in Algeria under French colonial rule, lived through the convulsions of war and political upheaval, and infused his work with a philosophical quietude grounded in moral rebellion. While often associated with existentialism, Camus rejected that label. He charted his own course, what he called absurdism, a recognition that life is inherently without clear meaning, and yet humans persist in seeking meaning anyway. This tension between the human desire for coherence and the indifference of the universe is what he termed the absurd. In The Myth of Sisyphus, his most famous philosophical essay, Camus introduces a startling image: a man condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down for eternity. This Greek myth becomes, for Camus, a metaphor for the human condition. Day after day, we labor under the weight of tasks, ambitions, dreams, and suffering, knowing full well that death will one day erase all. The absurd is not despairing, but clear-eyed. It does not call for suicide as an escape, but rather an embrace of life in full awareness of its absurdity. Camus wrote, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. It is a radical act to choose joy and defiance in a world that does not guarantee meaning." Camus' thought was not only about metaphysics, it was also about ethics. In novels like The Plague and The Stranger, he portrayed characters who, in the face of meaningless suffering, choose solidarity, kindness, or personal truth. For Camus, rebellion is the beginning of morality, not rebellion in violence, but in choosing to care even when nothing compels you to. He also warned against ideological absolutism, seeing how utopian visions can justify horrors, as witnessed in both fascist and Stalinist regimes. Camus's philosophy is modest, humble, and human. He does not offer salvation, but instead a way to walk through life with dignity and honesty, even in the silence of the universe. If Camus gave us the language of existential struggle, Hannah Arendt, 1906 to 1975, gave us the tools to understand political evil, responsibility, and the fragility of human freedom. A German Jewish philosopher who fled the Nazis and later settled in the United States, Arendt's work defies easy classification. She was not interested in systems, but in the lived experiences of politics, action, and moral judgment. Her writings offer no blueprint, but rather an invitation to think critically and live responsibly. In The Human Condition, 1958, Arendt laid out a vision of what it means to be human, not as a solitary thinker, but as a political being capable of speech, action, and plurality. She distinguishes three modes of human activity: labor, the cyclical tasks of survival; work, the creation of a stable world of objects; and action, the uniquely human ability to initiate change through speech and deeds. For Arendt, freedom is not a private possession. It arises between people in the space of political action. We are not only citizens, we are co-creators of the world we inhabit. But Arendt is perhaps most famous and controversial for her analysis of totalitarianism. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1951, she traced how regimes like Nazism and Stalinism emerged not from chaos, but from the breakdown of traditional institutions and the manipulation of mass loneliness. Totalitarianism for Arendt was not just about brutality. It was about the erasure of individuality, the fusion of fact and fiction, and the systematic destruction of reality itself. Her report on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi bureaucrat who orchestrated the logistics of the Holocaust, led to her famous phrase, "the banality of evil." Arendt was struck not by Eichmann's monstrosity, but by his mediocrity, his inability to think for himself, his reliance on clichés, and his failure to imagine the consequences of his actions. Evil, she suggested, could be committed not only by sadists, but by ordinary people who stop thinking and surrender moral judgment to obedience. Arendt's work remains urgent today as we grapple with disinformation, authoritarianism, and the tension between freedom and security. She reminds us that thinking itself, reflective, self-critical, independent thinking, is a political act. When individuals refuse to think, societies lose their capacity for moral judgment. And when public spaces collapse into shouting matches or echo chambers, the fabric of democracy begins to unravel. In different ways, both Camus and Arendt confronted the void left by traditional belief systems and offered something more grounded than transcendence, responsibility. Whether in the silence of an absurd cosmos or the noise of political catastrophe, they urge us to remain human, aware, active, and awake. Their philosophies do not offer escape, but presence. And in that presence, they find a form of meaning, not imposed, but created. As our journey through the minds of great philosophers nears its end, we see that philosophy, far from being an abstract pursuit, is deeply connected to how we live, love, think, and act. From ancient Greece to modern despair, from metaphysics to resistance, the philosopher's task remains constant: to reflect, to question, and above all, to remain human. As we move into the 21st century, philosophy continues not as a static archive of ideas, but as a living, breathing force, reaching into politics, technology, culture, and our daily emotional lives. The torch once carried by Camus and Arendt has now passed to a diverse array of thinkers who speak from many corners of the globe. Their concerns are not only metaphysical, but deeply ethical: how to live with dignity in a world reshaped by algorithms, ecological collapse, and shifting identities. These contemporary voices challenge us not only to think clearly, but to feel more deeply, act more justly, and imagine more boldly. Martha Nussbaum, an American philosopher born in 1947, is among the most influential moral thinkers of our time. Her work spans classical philosophy, political theory, psychology, and law. At the heart of her thought is a commitment to human dignity, particularly for those often left at the margins: women, the disabled, the poor, and the elderly. Instead of measuring justice by wealth or utility alone, Nussbaum urges us to ask, what is each person actually able to do and to be? This is the foundation of her capabilities approach, developed in collaboration with economist Amartya Sen. In contrast to narrow economic measures like GDP, Nussbaum suggests that a truly just society must guarantee that all individuals can flourish, to be well nourished, to express emotions, to imagine, to engage in relationships, and to participate in political life. She argues that emotional life is not separate from reason, but central to it. In books like Upheavals of Thought and Political Emotions, she explores how love, grief, and compassion can ground a more humane politics. Her work is especially vital in a world fractured by inequality, political resentment, and dehumanization. Whether she is defending animal rights, writing about aging with dignity, or analyzing the rhetoric of fear in democracy, Nussbaum reminds us that philosophy must begin where people live and suffer. Cornel West, a philosopher, theologian, and public intellectual, brings a fiery, prophetic voice to modern philosophy. Born in 1953, West's work is deeply rooted in the Black radical tradition, drawing inspiration from figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X. He blends philosophy, jazz, religion, and activism into a soulful critique of American democracy, capitalism, and moral complacency. At the heart of West's thought is what he calls deep democracy, a vision that demands not only formal rights, but spiritual vitality, compassion, and truth-telling. In his landmark book, Race Matters, 1993, he challenged liberal optimism and conservative denial by confronting the wounds of racism, inequality, and nihilism in American life. West does not shy away from crisis. He believes that to be a philosopher is to speak uncomfortable truths with love. Never forget, he writes, justice is what love looks like in public. For West, philosophy is inseparable from struggle. He teaches us that to think well, we must also feel deeply, sing freely, and act courageously. Whether writing on the blues, reading Plato, or marching with labor unions, West embodies philosophy as a form of democratic soulcraft. From Seoul to Berlin, the Korean-German philosopher Byung-Chul Han has emerged as a keen observer of contemporary malaise. In a series of slim yet piercing books, including the Burnout Society, the Transparency Society, and Psychopolitics, Hahn examines the paradoxes of our hyper-connected, performance-obsessed era. His central claim is both simple and haunting. The more free we become under neoliberalism, the more we internalize pressure to be constantly productive, efficient, and optimized. Unlike previous eras shaped by prohibition and discipline, ours is shaped by positivity and self-surveillance. We no longer need oppressive rulers. We exploit ourselves. Fatigue, depression, and anxiety are no longer just psychological issues, but political symptoms. Hahn's style is meditative, sometimes poetic, and always disarming. He draws from Heidegger, Foucault, and Eastern philosophy to diagnose the spiritual emptiness of a society addicted to transparency and speed. For Hahn, the future of freedom lies not in doing more, but in rediscovering slowness, contemplation, and silence. His work is a philosophical whisper in a world of noise, a call to pause, reflect, and resist the tyranny of relentless productivity. What does it mean to be a philosopher today in a world shaped by climate change, artificial intelligence, global pandemics, and shifting notions of gender and identity? Contemporary philosophy must face these realities head-on. In the ethics of AI, thinkers are wrestling with how to create algorithms that respect human dignity. What does it mean for machines to make decisions about healthcare, employment, or criminal justice? Philosophers like Shannon Valor and Luciano Floridi argue for techno-moral virtues, bringing ancient wisdom to new tools. The challenge is not only how we shape machines, but how they shape us. In climate ethics, philosophers are asking who bears responsibility for ecological destruction and how to imagine justice for future generations. From indigenous epistemologies to eco-feminist frameworks, there is growing recognition that the planet itself must be treated not as resource, but as relation. In gender and identity, debates are no longer limited to binary categories. Trans and non-binary thinkers challenge traditional assumptions about the self. Philosophers like Judith Butler, Paul Preciado, and others explore how identity is not fixed, but performed, fluid, and politically charged. These questions are not merely academic, they ripple through education, healthcare, and civil rights. In all these areas, the role of philosophy remains what it has always been, not to provide easy answers, but to ask better questions, to hold space for ambiguity, to build bridges between reason and emotion, between the personal and the political, between the ancient and the emergent. From Socrates to Simone de Beauvoir, from Descartes to Byung-Chul Han, the story of philosophy is not a ladder, but a river, winding, branching, sometimes turbulent, always flowing. And those who choose to wade in are not seekers of certainty, but companions in the art of living thoughtfully. As we drift gently into the closing moments of this journey, let us carry with us not conclusions, but the courage to continue thinking.